The small elven girl fell through the cold night air with her arms reaching upward toward the sky were her own. People had just thrown her away from the high cliff edge above, and the wind screamed past her ears as she tumbled down and down toward. The sharp rocks below that waited to end her short life at only 7 years of age, and tears streamed from her eyes, but not from fear of dying, but from the pain of betrayal by those she had trusted most in all the world. Kira Nightwhisper had committed what the Elven Elders called the greatest crime possible for any elf to commit, and that crime was showing kindness and friendship to a dragon hatchling that had been caught in a poacher trap near the forest edge 3 months before. This terrible night, and she had freed the small creature and fed it and cared for its injured wing until it could fly again, and the bond between them had grown strong and pure. Elders had discovered her secret friendship when she brought food to the dragon one evening, and old Valdris Starweaver himself had led the council in judgment against her. They declared that no elf should ever befriend a dragon because dragons were meant to be controlled and dominated and used as weapons of war, and not treated as equals or companions. And the punishment for her crime was death by throwing from the Crimson Gorge cliff. She closed her eyes as the rocks rushed up to meet her, and waited for the impact that would end everything, but instead she felt something warm and scaled wrap around her falling body, and suddenly she was no longer falling, but rising back up into the sky. And when she opened her eyes, she saw Ember, the dragon hatchling she had saved, and he had grown larger in the past weeks, and his wings beat powerfully as he carried her away from certain death. Ember flew through the night carrying the broken and bleeding child away from the elven lands and toward the forbidden wastes where no civilized creature dared to go, and there in that harsh and unforgiving land of ash and ruins they found shelter in an ancient cave system that had once belonged to some forgotten race, and Kira slowly healed from her injuries over many painful weeks while Ember hunted small creatures to feed them. Both the years that followed were hard beyond anything the young elf had ever imagined possible, and every day was a fight for survival against the elements and the dangerous creatures that roamed the wastes. And the lack of food and clean water, and the bitter cold of winter nights, and the scorching heat of summer days. But through it all, Kira and Ember stayed together and protected each other and grew stronger. Kira learned to hunt with bow and blade, and to track prey across barren ground, and to find water in the driest places, and to make shelter from almost nothing, and her body became lean and hard and covered in scars from countless battles and close calls with death, and her mind became sharp and focused on survival above all else. Ember grew from a small hatchling into a powerful dragon, the size of a large house with scales that gleamed deep crimson in the sunlight and could breathe fire hot enough to melt stone, and his bond with Kira deepened until they could almost sense each other's thoughts and feelings, and they moved together in combat. Like two parts of one being, 15 long years passed in the wastes, and the child who had been thrown away became a warrior that even the exile clans whispered about in fearful tones, and they called her the Cliff-Throne Child, said she rode a demon dragon and could kill with just a look, and most stayed far away from her territory. But despite all her strength and skill and survival, Kira never forgot the betrayal and the faces of those elders who had condemned her to death, and the question that burned in her heart every single day was why, and why had her people rejected her so completely for the simple act of showing mercy to an injured creature, and what kind of society could be so cruel to its own children? Then one day everything changed, when great ships descended from the stars and landed in the valleys beyond the wasteland borders, and these ships brought humans to the planet for the first time, and Kira watched from hiding as these strange, short-lived creatures began building their colony with amazing speed and technology that seemed like magic. The elven kingdoms responded with fear and anger and began preparing for war against these newcomers, but Kira felt something different when she observed the humans from a distance, and she saw how they worked together and helped each other and valued cooperation over domination, and she wondered if perhaps these aliens might be different from her own cruel people. She began learning the human language by intercepting their radio transmissions and listening carefully to their conversations and communications, and after several months, she could understand most of what they said, and even speak some basic phrases herself. And Ember seemed curious about these newcomers too, and would watch their flying machines with interest. Kira decided to keep watching and learning about the humans before making any contact, because trust was something she had lost long ago on that cliff edge, and it would take more than curiosity to make her reveal herself to anyone ever again. But deep in her heart, a small spark of hope began to grow, that maybe somewhere in this universe there existed people who were better than those who had cast her away. Maya Torres had always been the type of person who could not resist a mystery, and that curiosity had gotten her into trouble more times than she could count during her 3 years as a survey engineer for the human colony. But this time she knew she was pushing her luck further than ever before by entering the Forbidden Wastes alone, against direct orders from her commanding officers. Energy readings she had detected from orbit were unlike anything in the colony database, and they pulsed with a strange rhythm that seemed almost alive, and the patterns suggested technology far more advanced than anything humans or even the elves possessed, and Maya simply had to know what was creating those signals. Even it meant risking her career, or possibly her life. She guided her small survey drone deeper into the canyon system that cut through the wasteland like wounds in the planet's surface, and her instruments went crazy with readings that made no sense according to known physics, and the energy levels were off the charts, but stable somehow and clearly under some kind of control system. Ruins appeared suddenly as she rounded a bend in the canyon, and Maya gasped at the sight before her, because these were not natural rock formations, but clearly artificial structures built on a massive scale, with towers that still reached toward the sky despite being worn down by countless centuries of weather and time. She landed her drone on a flat area near what looked like an entrance to the main structure, and activated her scanning equipment and began taking readings and photographs and detailed measurements of everything she could see, and her hands shook with excitement because this discovery could change everything humanity knew about this planet history. The architecture was beautiful in a strange alien way, with flowing curves and sharp angles combined in ways that seemed impossible, and the materials were unlike anything she had seen before. In her instruments said they should not exist, but there they were, solid and real under her gloved hands. Maya was so focused on documenting the ruins that she failed to notice she was being watched until a deep, rumbling growl echoed through the canyon from somewhere above her position, and she spun around, reaching for the small plasma pistol at her belt, and found herself staring up at a dragon the size of a shuttlecraft perched on a rock outcropping. The dragon was magnificent and terrifying, with scales that gleamed red like fresh blood in the sunlight, and eyes that burned with intelligence far beyond any animal, and smoke curled from its nostrils. As it watched her with what might have been curiosity or hunger, she could not tell which. Then she noticed the rider sitting on the dragon back, and her breath caught, because this was clearly an elf, but unlike any elf she had seen in the intelligence briefings, and this one was lean and hard and covered in scars, and wearing a rough leather armor and carrying weapons that looked well used. The elf woman spoke in accented but clear human language, and said that Maya should not be here, because the elven kingdoms would kill any human they found this deep in contested territory, and her tone was not threatening, but simply stating a fact. Maya found her voice and explained about the energy readings and the ruins and her research, and as she talked she noticed the elf expression change from suspicion to interest, and when Maya mentioned wanting to understand the ancient technology, the elf seemed to make some kind of decision. The elf introduced herself as Kira and explained that she had lived in the wastes for 15 years and knew these ruins better than anyone alive, and after a long moment of studying Maya face as if searching for something, she offered to show Maya things that would answer many questions, but also raise new ones. Maya knew she should refuse and return to base immediately and report this contact, but her curiosity was stronger than her common sense had ever been, and besides, there was something in Kira that spoke of loneliness and pain and a desperate need to connect with someone who might understand. They spent the next several hours exploring the ruins together, with Kira pointing out features and systems that Maya instruments had missed, and explaining what little she had learned about the ancient builders through years of careful study and observation. The technology was incredibly advanced, and much of it was still functional after thousands of years, and Maya realized with growing excitement that this could give humanity access to power sources and defensive systems that would change the balance of power on this planet completely. But Kira also showed her the dark side of the ruins and pointed out weapon systems that could level mountains and scorch entire continents, and explained that the ancient builders had destroyed themselves in a terrible war that left the planet nearly lifeless for ages afterward. Maya asked why. Kira lived alone out here in the wastes, and after a long silence, the elf told her story about being thrown from a cliff as a child for the crime of befriending a dragon and surviving only because that same dragon had saved her, and how she had lived in exile ever since. The story made Maya angry on Kira's behalf because she could not imagine a society that would do such a thing to a child, and she said so. And Kira seemed surprised by her reaction. And they talked for hours about their different cultures and values and beliefs. As the sun began to set, Maya knew she had to return to base before search teams came looking for her, but she did not want to leave, and Kira seemed reluctant to let her go as well, and they agreed to meet again in secret to continue exploring the ruins together. Maya returned to her base and filed a carefully edited report that mentioned finding ancient ruins, but left out any mention of meeting Kira because she knew her superiors would either forbid further contact or try to capture the elf for interrogation, and neither option seemed right. Over the following weeks, Maya and Kira met regularly in secret, and their partnership grew into genuine friendship. And together they began unlocking secrets that had been buried for millennia, and neither realized that their actions were being watched by elven scouts who would soon report back to their superiors. The ancient chamber deep beneath the ruins hummed with power as Maya worked on decoding the control systems, while Kira stood guard near the entrance with Ember positioned outside to watch for any approaching threats. And over the past 2 months, their partnership had uncovered more about the planet history than either civilization had learned in centuries. Maya hands moved quickly over the holographic interface that had activated when they restored power to this section, and the symbols were beginning to make sense to her now, and what they revealed was both amazing and terrifying in equal measure. Ancient builders had been incredibly advanced, and they had created weapons and power systems that could reshape entire worlds, and their technology made both human and elven achievements look primitive by comparison, but they had also destroyed themselves in a war so terrible that it nearly ended all life on the planet. Leaned over Maya's shoulder and pointed at a series of symbols that kept repeating and asked what they meant, and Maya translated slowly because the concept was difficult, and explained that these were warnings about something sleeping deep in the planet Kortha. Ancient weapons had awakened something during the final war, and that something had consumed entire cities before the builders managed to put it back to sleep using systems that were still active deep underground. And if those systems ever failed or were damaged, the thing would wake. Again, Maya pulled up star charts and historical records from the database and showed Kira how the elven kingdoms had been hiding this knowledge for thousands of years and had built their entire civilization on top of the ancient ruins while pretending they did not exist. Kira's face grew dark with anger as she realized the depth of the deception and understood that the elders who had thrown her from the cliff had known all along about the true history and had hidden it to maintain their power over the common people. Their discussion was interrupted by Ember. Urgent mental warning, and both women grabbed their weapons and rushed to the entrance, where they found elven scouts surrounding the ruins, with weapons drawn and dragons circling. Overhead, the lead scout called out, demanding that Kira surrender and return to face judgment for her crimes, and that the human be handed over for interrogation and execution, and his voice carried the authority of High Chancellor Valdris himself. Kira stepped forward with her bow ready and told them she would never surrender to those who had tried to murder her as a child, and Maya stood beside her with her plasma pistol charged and ready. Despite knowing they were badly outnumbered, the scouts attacked without further warning, and arrows filled the air, while dragonfire scorched the ground where Maya and Kira had been standing, but they had already moved, with Ember snatching them both up and launching into the sky. The chase that followed was desperate and violent, with elven dragons pursuing them through canyons and over mountains, while Ember flew with all his speed and strength. to keep ahead of their attackers, and Maya clung to Kira's waist while firing her pistol at any dragon that got too close. They barely made it to human territory, and when they crossed the border, the elven dragons broke off pursuit rather than risk starting a war. But Kira knew this was only the beginning, and that Valdris would not stop until she was dead. And Maya, with her commander, Helenstone, listened to Maya report with a grave expression and examined the data and images they had brought back from the ruins. And when Maya finished explaining about the ancient weapons and the sleeping threat, the commander sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Stone spoke and said that this changed everything, and that the elven kingdoms had been lying to humanity about the planet history while preparing for war, and that the ancient technology could give humans the means to defend themselves against superior elven numbers. She turned to Kira and asked directly if she would help train human forces in elven tactics and strategy and share her knowledge of their weaknesses, and in return, humanity would offer her protection and a place in their society. Kira looked at Maya, and then back at the commander, and said she would do more than just help them defend, and that she wanted to make the elves pay for 15 years of exile and for throwing away a child who had only shown kindness. Stone nodded slowly and began issuing orders to her staff, and within hours, the human colony went on full war alert, with defensive positions being reinforced and weapons being distributed and scout teams being sent out to monitor elven movements. Maya worked with human engineers to create plans for accessing more of the Ems in ruins and activating defensive systems that could protect key human installations, and Kira began training special forces teams in combat techniques specifically designed to counter elven dragon riders. Over the next few weeks, tensions escalated rapidly as elven kingdoms united under Valdris' leadership and began massing forces along the border and demanding that humans surrender all claim to the planet and leave or face total annihilation. Human colonists, who had come seeking a new home and a fresh start, found themselves facing a war they never wanted against an enemy that had lived on this world for thousands of years and had magic and dragons on their side. But they also had something the elves did not expect, and that was human adaptability and determination and willingness to use any advantage they could find. And most importantly, they had Kira, who knew elven warfare better than any living elf and hated her own people enough to ensure their defeat. First attacks came without warning, on a cold morning when the sky filled with hundreds of dragon riders descending on human settlements with fire and arrows and magical weapons that tore through defensive barriers like paper. Human forces fought back with railguns and missiles and plasma weapons, but they were inexperienced in fighting aerial targets and suffered heavy casualties in those first engagements, and several outlying settlements were completely destroyed. Commander Stone activated the emergency protocols and called for all civilians to retreat to hardened shelters, while military units fell back to prepared defensive positions, and Maya worked frantically to bring more ancient weapons. Systems on Linikara and Ember took to the skies and engaged the elven riders with a fury that shocked both sides, and she tore through their formations, using techniques they had never seen before, and her knowledge of their tactics let her predict and counter every move they made. The war had begun, and it would be brutal and terrible. It would reshape the future of every living thing on the planet. The sky burned red with dragon fire as the third week of war turned the valleys between human and elven territory into a wasteland of scorched earth and broken bodies and machines, and neither side seemed willing or able to back down from total conflict. Human casualties mounted daily, despite their technological advantages, because the elves had thousands of years of combat experience in dragon riders who could strike from above with devastating effect and then vanish before human weapons could lock on targets. But the elves were learning that humans adapted faster than any enemy they had faced before, and what worked in the first week of fighting became suicidal by the second week as human defenses evolved and improved with terrifying speed. Kira stood in the command center studying tactical displays while Commander Stone coordinated defensive positions across multiple fronts, and Maya worked to bring another ancient weapons platform online from the ruins. The breakthrough came when Kira identified the pattern in elven attack formations and realized they had not changed their basic tactical doctrine in over 300 years, and she explained to Stone exactly where to position anti-air batteries to create killing Zone's human forces began implementing Kira strategies, and the results were immediate and dramatic, and elven dragon riders, who had grown used to easy victories, suddenly found themselves flying into carefully prepared ambushes. The elves responded by committing more riders and larger dragons to each attack, but this only made them easier targets for human weapons, and the sky began to fill with falling dragons and their riders. Tumbling to earth, Kira and Ember fought in every major engagement and became legends to both sides, and human soldiers cheered when they saw the Crimson Dragon diving into enemy formations, while elven riders spoke of her in whispers as a demon who had returned from death to punish them. Maya succeeded in activating a network of ancient shield generators buried across the region, and these created protective barriers over key human installations that even Dragonfire could not penetrate, and this allowed human forces to consolidate their defenses. The elven High Chancellor Valdris grew desperate as his armies suffered losses they had never experienced before, and he committed his elite Skyguard to a massive assault meant to break human resistance once and for all. The Skyguard consisted of 50 of the most experienced dragon riders in elven history, and they rode ancient dragons over a century old, and each one was worth 10 normal riders in combat ability, and magical power. Commander Stone knew this battle would determine the outcome of the war and committed every available human asset to the defense, including experimental weapons that had not been fully tested and prototype fighters that might fall apart in combat. The Battle of Shattered Spires began at dawn when the Skyguard descended on the human fortress complex in a coordinated assault that shook the ground and filled the air with fire and lightning and magical forces that tore through defensive barriers. Human gunships rose to meet them, and the sky became a chaotic swirl of dragons and aircraft and missiles and magic all mixing together in a battle unlike anything the planet had seen in thousands of years. Skara led the human aerial forces with Ember at the vanguard, and her knowledge of Skyguard tactics allowed her to predict their movements and coordinate human responses with devastating precision. The battle raged for 3 days without pause, and neither side could gain a decisive advantage, and the ground below became littered with crashed aircraft and fallen dragons and the bodies of riders from both sides. Maya worked around the clock to keep the ancient weapons platforms operating and to coordinate their fire with human gunships, and several times the systems nearly overloaded from the strain, but she managed to keep them functional. The third day, Kira spotted the Skyguard commander riding a massive black dragon that was clearly the oldest and most powerful of all, and she knew that killing him would break the elite unit morale. She guided Ember into a dive that took them through a storm of enemy fire and closed with the Skyguard commander in a brutal aerial duel that tested every skill she had learned in 15 years of survival. The two dragons clashed in midair with claws and fire and teeth while their riders exchanged arrows and spells and blade strikes, and the fight was so intense that both human and elven forces stopped to watch. Ember was younger and faster, but the black dragon had centuries of experience in magic that could turn aside normal weapons. But Kira had learned to fight without relying on magic, and she used speed and cunning instead. She waited for the perfect moment when the black dragon committed to a dive, and then guided Ember into a sharp turn that brought them above and behind their opponent and before the Skyguard commander could react. She put 3 arrows through his neck. Commander fell from his dying dragon and plummeted toward the ground far below, and the black dragon followed him down, trailing smoke and blood, and crashed into the mountainside with an impact that shook the valley. The Skyguard formation broke apart as their leader fell, and human forces pressed the attack with renewed fury, and over the next few hours, 30 more elite dragons were brought down by concentrated fire. By sunset on the third day, the Skyguard had been destroyed as a fighting force with only a handful of survivors fleeing back to Elven territory, and the greatest military unit in Elven history had been shattered by a combination of human technology and one exiled determination. The victory came at terrible cost, with over half the human aerial fleet destroyed and thousands of soldiers dead or wounded, but it had broken the back of the Elven offensive and forced Valdris to reconsider his strategy. In the command center, Commander Stone looked at the casualty reports and the tactical assessments and knew that, while they had won this battle, the war could not continue. Because both sides were bleeding themselves to death, Maya had even worse news, because her analysis of the ancient weapons systems showed they were destabilizing the planet's tectonic balance, and if the fighting continued, they would trigger the same cataclysm that had destroyed the ancient builder Skara. Sat alone that night looking at the stars and thinking about all the death and destruction and wondering if revenge had been worth the price. And Ember curled around her, sensing her troubled thoughts and offering what comfort he could. War had reached a turning point, but whether it would end in peace or mutual destruction remained to be seen. Maya stood in the deepest chamber of the ancient ruins with sweat running down her face. Despite the cold air and her hands shaking as she decoded the final warnings left by the builders who had destroyed themselves thousands of years ago, the truth was worse than anyone had imagined, because the ancient civilization had not simply destroyed themselves in war but had awakened something deep in the planet core, and that something still slept beneath their feet waiting for the right conditions to wake again. Every weapon system they had activated and every energy burst from the ancient platforms had been feeding power into the sleeping thing below, and the planet itself was beginning to destabilize in ways that would lead to massive volcanic eruptions and earthquakes within months. She rushed back to the surface, where Kira waited with Ember and showed her the data and explained that if the fighting continued, both humans and elves would face extinction, not from each other, but from the planet itself tearing apart beneath them. Kara looked at the evidence and felt a cold weight settle in her chest, because she had fought so hard for revenge, and now that revenge was going to kill everyone, including the innocent people who had nothing to do with her exile. They returned to the human command center and presented their findings to Commander Stone, who immediately understood the implications and called an emergency meeting of the civilian government. Decision was made quickly because there was no real choice, and Stone authorized Kira to contact the Elven High Chancellor under flag of truce and request immediate negotiations to end the war before it was too late. The message was sent through Dragon Rider channels, and for 2 days there was no response, and Kira began to fear that Valdris would rather see the world burn than admit defeat or make peace with humans. Then the reply came, and Valdris agreed to meet at neutral ground with representatives from both sides to discuss terms, and the location chosen was the same cliff from which Kira had been thrown 15 years before then. Meeting was tense, with armed guards from both sides watching each other suspiciously and weapons ready in case of treachery, and Kira walked forward with Commander Stone and Maya at her sides. Valdris stood on the cliff edge with his own advisors and guards, and when he saw Kira, his ancient face showed something that might have been regret, or possibly just weariness from the long war. He spoke first and said that he had never expected her to survive the fall, and that seeing her alive after all these years was like seeing a ghost return from the dead to haunt him. Kira felt rage rising in her throat, but forced it down and replied that he had thrown a child from this cliff for showing kindness, and that the child had not only survived, but had returned to show him the cost of his cruelty. She told him about the sleeping threat below and showed him the data that Maya had gathered, and explained that if they did not stop fighting immediately, the entire planet would be destroyed within months. Valdris listened in silence and then consulted with his advisors, and after a long discussion he admitted that Elven scholars had suspected something was wrong with the ancient sites, but had hidden the truth to maintain control over the population. Commander Stone stepped forward and proposed terms for an immediate ceasefire, followed by joint research into the threat and shared access to the ancient technology under carefully controlled conditions. The negotiations took 3 months, with both sides arguing over every detail, and multiple times the talks nearly broke down completely, but each time Kira stepped in as mediator because she understood both cultures. Her unique position as an elf who had been raised in exile and befriended humans made her the only person both sides would trust, and she used that trust to push them toward compromise even when neither wanted to give ground. Final treaty included provisions for immediate cessation of all hostilities and joint scientific teams to study the ancient ruins and stabilize the sleeping threat, and most importantly, a full pardon for all elves who had been exiled or judged unfairly by the old system. Kira read the clause about pardons, and felt emotions. She had kept buried for 15 years, finally surfaced, and for the first time since. That terrible night on the cliff, she allowed herself to cry. The signing ceremony was held at the ruins where Maya and Kira had first met, and representatives from both civilizations gathered to witness the historic moment when two species chose cooperation over destruction. Valdris approached Kira privately after the signing and offered her a position on the ruling council, and said she had earned the right to help shape the future of elven society. She looked at the old elf who had condemned her to death, and felt the anger and hate that had sustained her for so long finally begin to fade, and in its place came something unexpected, which was pity. Declined his offer and explained that she had spent 15 years learning to survive alone, and now wanted to spend the next 15 learning to build something with others who shared her values. Accepted a position as liaison between human and elven research teams working on the ancient sites, and Maya was assigned as her human counterpart, and together they would ensure the technology was used wisely. The months that followed, human engineers and elven mages worked side by side, excavating the ruins under carefully controlled conditions and learning to combine their different approaches to knowledge and discovery. The sleeping threat was gradually contained through a combination of human technology and elven magic, and ancient systems that had been feeding it power for millennia were safely shut down. One by one, Kira stood on the cliff edge one evening, watching the sun set over the valley where two civilizations were building a shared future. An Ember perched beside her with his scales gleaming in the fading light. Maya joined her, carrying documents about their latest findings, and sat down next to her friend, and they talked about everything they had accomplished and everything still left to do. Kara realized that the child who had been thrown from this cliff had died that night 15 years ago, and in her place had grown someone stronger and harder, but also someone who had learned that strength alone was not enough. Real victory was not in defeating her enemies, but in finding people worth building something with, and in learning that the courage to trust again after betrayal was harder and more important than any battle she had ever fought together. The warrior and the engineer descended from the cliff to return to their work, and behind them Ember spread his wings and roared, not in challenge or anger, but in triumph at having found a home after so many years of wandering. The age of isolation had ended for both Kira and her people, and the age of cooperation born from a child fall and a human curiosity had begun. And whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together rather than alone.